Long ago, when the world was younger and the spirits walked closer to men, there lived a village called Amuro. It sat like a beautiful crown between rolling hills and a thick, green forest. The people of Amuro were kind and shared everything, their food, their stories, and their troubles. Every morning, the sun would paint the sky orange and pink above their mud houses. Women would grind millet while singing old songs. Children would chase chickens and laugh until their bellies hurt. Men would sharpen their tools and talk about the rains. But in this peaceful village lived a man who was different from all the others. His name was Okiti, and he was the strongest hunter in all the land. His arms were like tree trunks, his eyes were sharp like an eagle's, and his arrows never missed their target. The people respected Okiti for his skill, but they whispered about his heart. While everyone else shared their harvest, their stories, and their smiles, Okiti kept everything for himself. He had forgotten the most important lesson his grandmother had taught him long ago: a man who eats alone will die alone. Okiti woke before the sun every day. While others were still dreaming, he would take his bow, his sharpest arrows, and his hunting bag. He would walk into the forest as quietly as a shadow, moving between the trees like he was born there. The forest animals feared him. When they heard his footsteps, rabbits would freeze in terror. When they saw his shadow, antelopes would run faster than the wind. Even the wild pigs, with their sharp tusks and bad tempers, would hide when Okiti came near. But Okiti was smarter than all of them. He knew where the animals drank water. He knew where they slept. He knew their paths through the thick bushes. His grandfather had taught him these secrets, and his grandfather's grandfather had taught them too. Every hunt was the same story. Okiti would return to the village with meat enough to feed 10 families. The other hunters would look at his kill with wonder and respect. "How does he do it?" they would whisper to each other. "The spirits must love him very much." But if the spirits truly loved Okiti, why was his heart so cold? While the sun set and the village grew quiet, Okiti would sneak to his compound like a thief. He would hide his meat in secret places, buried in clay pots, wrapped in banana leaves, stored in holes he had dug behind his house. Then, when the moon was high and everyone was asleep, Okiti would build a small fire. He would cook his meat slowly, enjoying the smell and the taste all by himself. His belly would be so full he could barely move, but still he would not share even the smallest piece. The smoke from his fire would rise into the night sky, carrying the delicious smell of roasted meat throughout the village. Hungry children would smell it in their dreams. Tired mothers would wake up and wonder where such wonderful food was cooking. Old men would remember the taste of meat and lick their lips. But when morning came, Okiti would clean his compound carefully. He would bury the bones and scatter the ashes. He would wash his pots and hide them away. Then he would sit with the other villagers and pretend to be hungry just like them. "The hunt was difficult yesterday," he would lie. "I found nothing in the forest. The rains that year came late. The clouds would gather in the sky like dark blankets, but they would pass without dropping water on the thirsty earth. The crops in the fields began to turn yellow and die. The yams in the ground became small and hard. The millet stalks bent over like old men walking with sticks." Day after day, the people of Amuro looked up at the empty sky and prayed for rain. The village priest offered sacrifices to the sky god. The women sang rain songs that their grandmothers had taught them. The children drew pictures of clouds in the dust with their fingers. But still the rain did not come. The farms that usually fed the village became like empty bowls. The food that families had stored began to disappear. Mothers started cooking smaller portions. Fathers began eating less so their children could have more. The widows, who had no husbands to farm for them, began to go hungry. The old people, who could not work in the fields anymore, started to become thin and weak. Even the children's laughter became quieter as their stomachs began to hurt from emptiness. But through all this suffering, smoke still rose from Okiti's compound every night. Little Nkem was only 6 years old, but she understood hunger. Her father had died the year before, and her mother worked hard to take care of her and her baby brother. But when the farms failed, there was no work for her mother to do, and no food for them to eat. Every evening, Nkem would sit outside her house and smell the meat cooking from somewhere in the village. The smell made her stomach dance with hope, but it also made her cry because she could never find where it was coming from. "Mama," she would ask, "who is cooking meat while we eat only dried corn?" Her mother would hold her tight and say, "I don't know, my child. But we must be grateful for what we have." All around the village, other children were asking the same question. Their parents would shake their heads and look worried. They knew someone had food to share, but they didn't know who it was. Old Mama Adunni, who had lived longer than anyone in the village, would rock her thin body back and forth and whisper old proverbs. When one person eats meat while others eat leaves, the ancestors are watching. They remember everything. But Okiti did not care about the ancestors. He only cared about his full belly. Widow Obiageli had been proud her whole life. When her husband was alive, their compound was always full of food and laughter. She had never needed to ask anyone for anything. But now, with her 3 children growing thinner every day, pride became a luxury she could not afford. She took her clay bowl and walked from compound to compound, begging for any food that families could spare. Most people wanted to help, but they had so little for themselves. A handful of corn here, a small yam there, these tiny gifts kept her children alive but never filled their bellies. One evening, following the smell of cooking meat, she found herself near Okiti's compound. The smell was strongest here, and she could see smoke rising from behind his house. Her heart filled with hope. Surely, if Okiti was cooking meat, he would share some with hungry children. She knocked on his door. "Brother Okiti," she called softly. "Please, my children have not eaten meat in many weeks. If you have anything to spare." But Okiti had heard her coming. He had quickly hidden his pot and scattered his fire. When he opened his door, his face looked annoyed and his breath still smelled like roasted antelope. "Sister, I wish I could help you," he lied smoothly. "But I have no meat. I have been eating only dried corn, just like everyone else." Okiti had become an expert at lying. When people asked him about the smoke from his compound, he would say he was burning old leaves to keep mosquitoes away. When they asked about the delicious smells, he would pretend he couldn't smell anything at all. "Maybe the wind is bringing smells from another village," he would suggest with a straight face. When the other hunters complained about finding no animals in the forest, Okiti would nod and agree. "Yes, it's very strange," he would say. "The animals seem to have disappeared. Maybe they have moved deeper into the forest because of the dry season." But this was not true. Okiti knew exactly where to find the animals. While the other hunters searched the easy places near the village, he would go to the secret spots his grandfather had shown him. These were hidden valleys where water still flowed, where the grass was still green, and where animals still came to drink and rest. Every few days, Okiti would return from these secret places with enough meat to feed his whole neighborhood. But instead of sharing it, he would sneak it home in the darkness and feast alone while his neighbors went to sleep hungry. The spirits who lived in the forest watched all of this, and they were not pleased. Namdi was the oldest and wisest man in Amuro. His hair was white like cotton, and his face was marked with lines that told stories of many years. People came to him when they had problems they couldn't solve, and young men came to him to learn about the old ways. For weeks, Namdi had been watching and thinking. He noticed that Okiti always looked well-fed while others grew thin. He noticed that Okiti's compound smelled like meat while others smelled like hunger. He noticed that Okiti spoke about bad hunting while his eyes looked satisfied and his belly looked full. One morning, after praying to the ancestors for guidance, Namdi decided to visit Okiti. He walked slowly to the hunter's compound, his walking stick tapping against the hard ground. "Good morning, my son," he greeted Okiti with the respect that was due to a skilled hunter. "Good morning, elder," Okiti replied, but his voice sounded nervous. Namdi sat down under the big tree in Okiti's compound and looked around carefully. He saw the spots where fires had been built and quickly covered. He saw the places where the ground had been disturbed, as if things had been buried and dug up. Most importantly, he smelled the faint scent of meat that seemed to live in the very walls of Okiti's house. "My son," Namdi said gently, "we need to talk." "Okiti," the elder said, his voice gentle but serious, "I have lived in this village for more than 70 years. I have seen many dry seasons, many times of hunger, and many times plenty. In all those years, I have learned something important about the spirits of our land." Okiti shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "The spirits gave you great skill as a hunter," Namdi continued. "Your arrows fly straighter than any other man's. Your feet move quieter than the wind. Your eyes see things others cannot see. These are gifts, my son. But gifts are not given for only one person to enjoy." The old man pointed his walking stick toward the village center, where thin children played quiet games in the dust. When the spirits give a man the ability to catch more food than he can eat, they expect him to feed others. When they make a man strong, they expect him to help the weak. Okiti's face grew hard. "Elderly, with respect, I work hard for my meat. I wake before dawn. I walk many miles in the forest. I risk my life with dangerous animals. Why should I give away what I earn?" Namdi shook his head sadly. "My son, you think your skill comes only from your work. But you forget, who taught the animals where to hide? Who makes the rivers flow so they can drink? Who decides whether your arrows find their target? The spirits can give, and the spirits can take away." Okiti stood up quickly, his face showing anger. "Elder, I respect you, but I think you are wrong. The spirits did not kill those antelopes, I did. The spirits did not aim my arrows, I did. The spirits did not track the animals through the forest, I did." He began pacing back and forth, his voice growing louder. "I have trained since I was a boy. I have learned every secret of hunting. I have made my body strong and my aim perfect. This meat is mine because I earned it with my own hands." The old man watched Okiti with sad eyes. He had seen this pride before, in other young men in other times. It never ended well. "And what about your neighbors?" Namdi asked quietly. "What about the widows who have no husbands to hunt for them? What about the children who cry themselves to sleep because their bellies are empty? What about the old people who are too weak to find food for themselves?" Okiti shrugged his shoulders. "They should work harder. They should learn to hunt like I do. I am not responsible for feeding the whole village." Namdi stood up slowly, leaning heavily on his walking stick. "My son, I am very sad to hear these words from you. Your grandfather was a generous man. Your father shared everything he had. I remember when you were a baby, and your family had no food. The whole village came together to make sure you did not starve. Have you forgotten this?" But Okiti had forgotten. Pride had made him blind to everything except his own desires. As Namdi prepared to leave Okiti's compound, he turned back one more time. His old eyes looked directly into Okiti's young ones, and when he spoke, his voice carried the power of many generations. "My son, listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. The spirits of our ancestors are patient, but they are not blind. They see everything, every piece of meat you hide, every hungry child you ignore, every lie you tell to hide your selfishness." The wind suddenly grew still, as if the forest itself was listening to the elder's words. "I have lived long enough to see what happens to men who forget their duty to their community. The same gifts that make them strong can become the source of their downfall. The same skills that bring them success can become useless when the spirits withdraw their blessing." Okiti wanted to laugh at the old man's words, but something in Namdi's voice made him feel uneasy. "You think your strength and skill will last forever," the elder continued. "You think you will always be able to take whatever you want from the forest. But remember this, the forest belongs to the spirits, not to you. They allow you to hunt in their domain, but their permission can be taken away." With these words, Namdi walked slowly toward the village, leaving Okiti standing alone in his compound. The hunter watched the old man disappear, then shook his head and went back into his house. But the elder's words followed him like shadows, and that night, his meat did not taste as sweet as usual. The next morning, Okiti woke before dawn as always. He took his sharpest arrows, his strongest bow, and his lucky hunting bag. The forest looked the same as it always did, green and thick and full of secret places. But when Okiti entered his favorite hunting spot, something felt different. The animals that usually drank at the hidden stream were not there. He waited quietly for an hour, then 2 hours, but no antelope came. He checked his other secret places, but they were all empty. Even the birds seemed to have disappeared from the trees. They must have moved to a different area, Okiti told himself. He walked deeper into the forest, to places he rarely visited because they were so far from the village. But these places too were empty of games. By afternoon, the sun was hot and Okiti was tired and frustrated. He had walked more miles than usual, set more traps than usual, and waited longer than usual. But his hunting bag remained empty. When he returned to the village, other hunters asked him about his day. "The animals are hiding today," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "Tomorrow will be better." But that night, for the first time in many months, no smoke rose from Okiti's compound. For the first time in many months, he went to sleep with an empty belly, just like his neighbors. Day after day, the same pattern repeated. Okiti would wake early, enter the forest with confidence, and return home empty-handed and confused. His secret hunting spots remained empty. His traps caught nothing. Even his sharpest arrows seemed to miss easy targets. At first, he blamed bad luck. Every hunter has difficult days, he told himself. Then he blamed the dry season. When the rains come, the animals will return, he reasoned. But deep in his heart, he began to remember the elders' words about the spirits taking away their gifts. The other hunters in the village were also struggling, but they had always struggled more than Okiti. For them, hunting had always been difficult, so a few days without success was not unusual. But for Okiti, who had never failed in the forest, each empty day felt like a personal defeat. His hidden stores of meat began to shrink. The clay pots buried behind his house, once full of dried antelope and wild pig, grew lighter each day. The bundles of smoked meat wrapped in banana leaves became smaller and smaller. For the first time since he was a boy, Okiti experienced real hunger. His stomach would growl loudly during village meetings. His hands would shake when he tried to string his bow. His eyes would water when he smelled food cooking from other compounds. But still, his pride would not let him ask for help. Okiti became desperate. He began waking even earlier, before the first rooster crowed. He would run to the forest instead of walking. He would stay out until after sunset, searching every valley, every stream, every hidden place he had ever known. One day, he climbed the tallest tree in the forest to look for animals from above. He could see for miles in every direction, but the forest floor looked empty and still. Another day, he followed the tracks of what he thought was a large antelope, only to discover they belonged to a village goat that had wandered into the forest and gotten lost. He tried changing his hunting style. Instead of waiting quietly for animals to come to him, he began chasing them through the bushes. Instead of using his grandfather's proven methods, he tried new techniques he invented on the spot. Nothing worked. The forest that had once welcomed him now seemed hostile and strange. Thorns caught his clothes where they never had before. Branches hid his face along paths he had walked 1,000 times. Even the familiar sounds of the forest, the bird calls, the insect buzzing, the rustle of leaves, seemed different and unfriendly. At night, alone in his compound, Okiti would spread his remaining stores of meat on the ground and count them like a miser counting coins. Each piece was precious now, each bite carefully measured to make the supply last as long as possible. 3 weeks after his hunting luck disappeared, Okiti ate his last piece of stored meat. It was a small portion of dried antelope that he had been saving for the most desperate moment. As he chewed it slowly, trying to make it last, he realized that tomorrow he would wake up with nothing to eat. That night, he could not sleep. He lay on his mat staring up at the roof of his house, listening to his stomach growl. For the first time in his adult life, he was truly hungry, not the pleasant emptiness before a good meal, but the deep, painful hunger that makes a person weak and desperate. He thought about the village children who had been feeling this same hunger for months. He thought about the widows who had begged at his door while he lied about having no food. He thought about the old people who had grown thin and weak while he feasted alone. But even with these memories filling his mind, Okiti's pride remained strong. "I will go hunting again tomorrow," he told himself. "I will find animals in a new part of the forest. I will not give up." When morning came, he took his hunting equipment and walked into the forest once more. But this time, weakness made his steps slow and unsteady. This time, hunger made his hands shake as he tried to aim his bow. This time, desperation made him careless and noisy as he moved through the trees. Of course, he found nothing. By the fourth week, Okiti had grown thin. His strong arms looked smaller. His proud walk became a tired shuffle. His bright eyes became dull and hollow. The man who had once been the strongest hunter in the village now looked like a normal. When they talked about hunger, he would nod and agree. When they shared their small portions of corn and yam, he would pretend he was not hungry. "I ate before I came," he would lie when someone offered him food. "My stomach is not feeling well today," he would say when he was too weak to accept invitations to eat with others. The villagers began to notice changes in him, but they did not understand what was happening. They saw that he looked thinner, but they thought it was because of the general hunger affecting everyone. They saw that he seemed tired, but they thought it was because hunting had become so difficult for everyone. Only Elder Nambi watched Okiti with knowing eyes. The old man said nothing, but sometimes he would shake his head sadly when he saw the proud hunter struggling to hide his weakness. One evening, as Okiti sat alone under the tree in his compound, Nambi passed by. The elder paused and looked at him with compassion. "My son," he said gently, "pride is a heavy load to carry when your belly is empty." But Okiti just turned away and said nothing. On the 5th week of his failed hunting, Okiti collapsed in the forest. He had been chasing the shadow of what he thought was a rabbit, but it turned out to be just leaves blowing in the wind. When he realized his mistake, despair and weakness overcame him, and he fell to his knees among the trees. For the first time in his adult life, Okiti cried. Great tears rolled down his thin cheeks as he knelt in the dirt, surrounded by the forest that had once made him rich and proud. His grandfather's bow lay beside him in the dust. His arrows were scattered around him like broken dreams. "Spirits of the forest," he whispered, "I don't understand what I have done wrong. Why have you turned against me? I have always been respectful in your domain. I have always followed the old hunting laws. Why do you punish me with emptiness?" But deep in his heart, he knew the answer. The spirits had not turned against him because of how he hunted, they had withdrawn their blessing because of what he did with what he hunted. They had given him abundance not for himself alone, but for his entire community. As he knelt there in the forest dirt, weak and broken and hungry, Okiti finally began to understand what Elder Namdi had tried to tell him. The gifts of the spirits were never meant to be hoarded. They were meant to be shared. But understanding came too late. His body was too weak, his pride too damaged, and his relationship with his community too broken for easy repair. When Okiti finally dragged himself back to the village that evening, he could barely walk. His legs shook with every step. His breathing came in short gasps. His hunting bag, which had once been heavy with meat, now contained only his empty water gourd and his useless arrows. As he passed through the village, people stopped their evening activities to stare at him. Children who had been playing stopped their games. Women who had been cooking dinner looked up from their pots. Men who had been talking under the big tree fell silent. They could all see that something terrible had happened to their once proud hunter. His clothes were torn and dirty. His face was gaunt and hollow. His eyes had the desperate look of a person who had lost everything. "Brother Okiti," called out one of the other hunters, "are you hurt? What happened in the forest?" But Okiti could not answer. He was too ashamed to admit his failure and too proud to ask for help. Instead, he just shook his head and stumbled toward his compound. As he walked, people whispered behind him. They felt sorry for him, but they also remembered all the times he had claimed to have no food while they could smell meat cooking in his compound. They remembered how he had refused to help when they were hungry. They remembered his lies and his selfishness. Compassion fought with resentment in their hearts, and many were not sure which feeling was stronger. Okiti's compound, which had once been his private kingdom, now felt like a prison. The spots where he had buried clay pots full of meat were just holes in the ground. The places where he had built secret fires to cook his solitary feasts were cold circles of ash. The house that had once been filled with the smell of abundance now smelled like dust and emptiness. He sat under his tree and looked around at his domain. Everything reminded him of his former prosperity and his current poverty. The strong wooden rack where he used to hang meat to dry now held nothing but spider webs. The large clay pots that had once stored his surplus now cracked in the heat, empty and forgotten. That night, as darkness fell over the village, Okiti heard the sounds of life from his neighbors' compounds. Children laughing. Mothers singing lullabies. Fathers telling stories. The ordinary sounds of community and family that he had always ignored while he feasted alone. But now those sounds made him feel lonelier than ever. He realized that in his greed for meat, he had starved himself of something even more important, the warmth of human connection. While he had been hiding from his neighbors to eat his solitary meals, he had cut himself off from the love and friendship that makes life sweet. As his stomach cramped with hunger, Okiti began to understand that he had been poor even when he was rich, and hungry even when he was full. In the 6th week of his hunger, Okiti finally broke. His pride crumbled like a wall hit by flood water. He could not pretend anymore. He could not lie anymore. He could not survive alone anymore. With trembling hands and a racing heart, he walked to the compound of his nearest neighbor. This was a family with several children, children he had heard crying from hunger while he ate meat in secret. The father was a farmer whose crops had failed in the drought. Okiti stood outside their compound for a long time before he found the courage to call out. "Brother Emeka," he said, his voice weak and shaking, "may I speak with you?" Emeka came out of his house and looked at Okiti with surprise. The once strong hunter now looked like a sick man. His clothes hung loose on his thin body. His face was drawn and pale. "Brother Okiti," Emeka said with concern, "you look unwell. What can I do for you?" For a moment, Okiti could not speak. The words he needed to say felt too heavy for his tongue. Finally, he whispered, "Brother, I am hungry. I have not eaten in 3 days. Please, do you have any food you could spare?" Emeka's face showed surprise, then understanding, then sadness. He had suspected that Okiti had been hoarding food during the village's time of need, but seeing the proud hunter reduced to begging gave him no satisfaction. It only made him sad for human foolishness. Emeka looked at Okiti with eyes full of compassion but also truth. "Brother," he said gently, "you know that my family has very little. We eat only one small meal each day. My children's ribs show through their skin. My wife grows weaker every week." Okiti's heart sank, but Emeka continued, "However, we have learned something during this time of hunger. We have learned that sharing a little food makes it taste better than eating a lot alone. If you are truly hungry, you are welcome to share our evening meal." That evening, Okiti sat with Emeka's family around their small fire. The food was simple, a thin porridge made from corn flour and a few wild vegetables. Each person's portion was tiny, barely enough to quiet the rumble in their stomachs. But as Okiti ate that simple meal, surrounded by a family that had chosen kindness over resentment, the food tasted better than any of the rich meat he had eaten alone. The warmth of the fire felt better than the secret fires he had built in solitude. The sound of children's voices felt more nourishing than all his hidden feasts. For the first time in his life, Okiti understood what he had been missing. He had thought that having more food would make him happier, but he discovered that sharing less food brought more joy. He had thought that keeping secrets would protect him, but he learned that openness brought connection. As he walked home that night, no longer hungry but still broken-hearted, Okiti finally understood the true meaning of the elder's words. Many seasons passed after that night. When the rains finally came, the crops grew green again. When the animals returned to the forest, hunting became easier for everyone. But Okiti was never quite the same hunter he had been before. His skill with bow and arrow remained, but his relationship with the forest spirits had changed. He could catch enough meat to feed himself and a little extra, but never again did he return from hunting with more than his neighbors could provide for themselves. The spirits had taught him a lesson about balance, and they made sure he remembered it. But Okiti had learned something more valuable than hunting skill. He had learned the joy of sharing and the warmth of community. Every piece of meat he brought home, he divided among the widows and the old people and the hungry children. Every successful hunt became a reason for the village to celebrate together. The children who had once cried themselves to sleep with hunger now ran to greet him when he returned from the forest. The widows who had once begged at his door now welcomed him as a brother. The old people who had once shaken their heads at his selfishness now smiled when they saw him coming. Elder Namdi, now even older and wiser, would sometimes sit with Okiti under the big tree in the village center. "My son," he would say with satisfaction, "you have learned the most important lesson a person can learn. When you care only for yourself, even your strength becomes your curse. But when you care for others, even your weakness becomes a blessing." And Okiti would nod, remembering the bitter taste of lonely abundance and the sweet taste of shared simplicity, knowing that the spirits had been merciful to teach him this lesson while there was still time to change. When you care only for yourself, even your strength becomes your curse. But when you share what you have with others, even a little becomes enough for everyone.